In 1859, a crowd gathered in St. Louis, Missouri, gazing up at a massive balloon swaying gently in the summer breeze. Painted on its side was a single bold word: Atlantic. Its pilot, a charismatic and eccentric man named John Wise, stood beside it with a confident grin, making final preparations for what he claimed would be the first transcontinental air voyage in American history. His plan: to ride the jet stream from Missouri to New York in under 48 hours. But there was a twist. Wise wasn't just chasing glory, he was carrying a government-sanctioned mailbag. If successful, it would be the first official airmail delivery in U.S. history. Newspapers across the country hailed it as the dawn of a new era. What they didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that this ambitious flight would go off course, land in enemy territory, spark a political crisis with one of America's closest neighbors, and nearly trigger a redrawing of the U.S. border. Sounds too dramatic? Stay with me. Let's rewind. In the mid-19th century, the United States was racing toward modernity. Railroads were cutting across the heartland. Telegraph wires stitched cities together. But air travel? That was still the stuff of wild dreamers and barnstormers. Enter John Wise. A veteran balloonist with dozens of successful ascents, he was a man obsessed with conquering the skies. He believed that high-altitude wind currents, what we now call jet streams, could serve as invisible highways for travel and mail, and he was determined to prove it. The U.S. Post Office, intrigued but cautious, allowed him to carry 123 letters as an experimental airmail delivery. No one expected much. Most thought the balloon would drift a few miles and come down in a cornfield. But Wise had other ideas. On August 17, 1859, he launched from St. Louis in his balloon, hoping to catch favorable winds toward the northeast. For the first hour, it seemed he might do just that. But then the wind shifted. The balloon veered north, then northwest. Within a few hours, it became clear he wasn't heading to New York. He was drifting toward the wild, contested borderlands of the upper Midwest, toward what was then a diplomatically sensitive zone between the United States and British North America, now Canada. At the time, the U.S. Canada border wasn't the firm line we know today. It was a patchwork of disputed territories, vague treaty language, and regional tensions. Local skirmishes and land claims were not uncommon. And this is where the story takes a turn from quirky aviation experiment to near international incident. Because when Wise's balloon finally lost altitude and crash-landed near Lake Huron, it wasn't U.S. soil he touched. It was British-controlled land. And the mailbag he carried marked U.S. Mail in bold lettering. The local Canadian militia, already wary of American encroachment, treated the balloon's arrival as suspicious at best, provocative at worst. They detained Wise. They confiscated the mailbag, and they reported the incident to higher authorities in Toronto, triggering a wave of bureaucratic confusion and diplomatic finger-pointing. Was this an accident or a test of boundaries? A harmless mail flight? Or a covert claim to contested land? The U.S. press cried foul. British officials accused America of playing games with sovereignty. And just like that, a balloon had landed in the middle of a geopolitical storm. What could have been a quirky footnote in the annals of aviation had now become a powder keg, and the fuse had already been lit. The balloon's crash landing was dramatic enough, but it was what came after that nearly altered the map of North America. When John Wise was taken into custody, he assumed it was a misunderstanding, something that would be cleared up with a few words and a handshake. After all, he was a civilian, a scientist, a dreamer. But the local authorities saw something else: an American aircraft, marked with national insignia carrying government mail, landing unannounced in a contested region. To them, this wasn't an accident. It looked like a provocation. Remember, this was a time when tensions between the United States and Britain were far from resolved. The War of 1812 wasn't exactly ancient history. Border incidents still flared up along the frontier, and trust was in short supply. Just a few years earlier, a pig shot on San Juan Island had nearly sparked a full-scale war. Yes, a pig. In that context, a balloon drifting over and touching down with official U.S. cargo? That was serious business. British colonial officials feared the balloon could be interpreted as an informal claim, especially given the location of the landing. Wise had come down just a few miles from a region where timber rights, water access, and native alliances were already in dispute. And let's not forget the era's obsession with maps. Borders in the 19th century weren't just political lines, they were existential. To diplomats, the balloon wasn't just an oddity, it was a data point, a potential argument, something to be used in the ever-growing pile of cartographic negotiations. Meanwhile, back in Washington, news of the incident traveled slowly but with increasing concern. At first, officials laughed it off. A balloon? Surely the British would see it for what it was. But when the Canadian press began spinning it as an intentional overflight, a demonstration of American aerial ambition, as one editorial put it, the tone changed. Congressmen began to ask questions. Was the post office involved in unauthorized reconnaissance? Had Wise been instructed to test northern air currents for military purposes? Ridiculous? Maybe. But remember, in times of tension, reason is often the first casualty. And then came the tipping point. A British official speaking off the record to a newspaper in Toronto hinted that the balloon's path might be used in future territorial discussions. That's all it took. American papers exploded with accusations. "Canada claims U.S. sky!" screamed one headline. In the absence of clear information, speculation filled the vacuum. Some claimed the British had shot the balloon down. Others said Wise was being held as a political prisoner. Calls for retaliation, or at least for clarification, rang out in Washington and Ottawa alike. In reality, Wise had already been released. He was safe, if embarrassed, and eager to retrieve his balloon and move on. But the political machinery was now in motion, and it wouldn't stop for facts. Instead, it escalated. Within weeks, diplomats were trading barbed letters, proposed boundary commissions were frozen, military patrols were increased on both sides of the Great Lakes, and quietly, in a back room of the U.S. State Department, someone began to draft a contingency plan for a border realignment, just in case negotiations broke down. All of this because of one balloon, one gust of wind, one uncontrolled descent into the wrong clearing. The butterfly had flapped its wings, and now the storm was gathering. Behind the scenes, efforts to de-escalate were already underway, but they weren't happening in grand halls of diplomacy. They were happening in the hands of one man, a relatively unknown U.S. consul stationed in Toronto named Elias B. Greeley. Greeley wasn't a major player in foreign affairs. He wasn't even particularly well liked by his superiors. But he had one crucial advantage. He knew the region, and he understood that the situation wasn't about the balloon, it was about what the balloon symbolized. So he made a risky move. He reached out directly to the Canadian authorities, bypassing layers of protocol, and proposed a discreet meeting not in a boardroom, but over dinner, somewhere quiet, off the record. At that meeting, Greeley made a bold pitch. He laid out what the balloon really was, an experiment. An eccentric one, yes, but not a provocation. He even brought with him a local newspaper clipping from weeks before the flight, announcing Wise's planned route and mail cargo. His argument was simple. If this had been a covert operation, would it really have been announced in the St. Louis Daily Democrat? The Canadians listened. They didn't promise anything. But the tension, for the first time in weeks, began to thaw. Back in the U.S., meanwhile, cooler heads were also beginning to prevail. A rising congressman named William Seward, yes, the same man who would later negotiate the purchase of Alaska, stood up in the House of Representatives and cautioned against turning a weather balloon into a diplomatic weapon. He argued that history would judge America not by how forcefully it defended its borders, but by how wisely it navigated misunderstandings. It was a voice of reason in a room increasingly crowded with sabers. Then came the break. A confidential memo circulated among British officials and eventually leaked to the press revealed that the Canadian militia had not interpreted Wise's landing as an invasion, but rather as a navigational mishap of negligible consequence. The memo had been buried in bureaucracy while political tempers flared, but its release changed everything. The narrative collapsed. Suddenly, the angry headlines faded. Letters to the editor shifted tone. The balloon was no longer a threat. It was a curiosity again. John Wise, now back in the U.S., tried to salvage the story. He gave interviews. He wrote a dramatic account of his capture. He even pitched the idea of another cross-country balloon flight, promising that this time he'd land where he was supposed to. But the moment had passed. The balloon that nearly started a crisis was quietly deflated, literally and politically. And yet, something had changed. That brief moment of panic had exposed a deeper fragility. It revealed how quickly symbols could override facts, how one drifting object could be interpreted as intent. But more than that, it revealed how new technologies like flight could outpace the diplomatic language of their time. There were no protocols for aerial incidents, no treaties that covered balloons. The laws of the land didn't yet extend into the sky, and that scared people. Governments realized they would soon have to answer new questions. What counts as sovereign airspace? Who's responsible for what falls from the sky? Where does the border begin when the wind doesn't care? The balloon incident may have ended without redrawn maps or exchanged fire, but it planted seeds. It accelerated discussions, quiet ones, about aerial law, border enforcement, and cross-border communication. It may even have nudged certain boundary commissions into completing their work a little faster, a little more precisely. After all, when the air becomes territory, mistakes have consequences. So the next time you look at a clean, static line on a map and assume it's always been there, remember this: that line is often the result of chaos, confusion, and near misses like the one we've just uncovered. And sometimes it's the wind that decides history. In the end, John Wise's balloon didn't change the borders of the United States, but it came remarkably close. Not because it was powerful, not because it was deliberate, but because it arrived at exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. A drifting envelope of silk filled with gas and ambition landed in a political minefield. And for a few tense weeks, that soft landing nearly created hard consequences. That's the part history textbooks rarely tell you, that diplomacy is often shaped not by treaties or wars, but by accidents. By the weather, by individual personalities, by missed memos in newspaper editorials, and sometimes by a balloon and a man with a dream. Looking back, we see it clearly. The balloon wasn't the cause of a crisis, it was the lens that exposed one already forming. The border tensions, the paranoia, the miscommunications, they were all there, waiting. The balloon simply brought them to the surface. Like a litmus test, it revealed how fragile peace can be when nations are suspicious, when media stirs panic, and when emerging technologies outpace the rules meant to contain them. And here's the moment of clarity, the eureka buried under layers of irony. The very thing John Wise was trying to prove, that the sky could unite the country, almost did the opposite. He imagined air travel as a symbol of progress, of connection, but his balloon became a symbol of intrusion. He dreamed of binding states together and nearly untied the border. But perhaps that's the deeper lesson, that every new invention, every new frontier, whether it's the sky in 1859 or cyberspace today, creates not just opportunity, but tension. It forces old systems to stretch, to adjust, or to break. And in that moment of stretch, the tiniest event can tip the balance. A gust of wind, a confused soldier, an editorial written in haste. The dominoes are always lined up, and most of the time we don't even see them until one falls. So, next time you hear about a balloon drifting across a border, or a satellite caught in the wrong orbit, or a drone veering off course, don't dismiss it. Look closer. History has a habit of repeating its rhythms, not with cannon fire, but with quiet collisions between ambition and misunderstanding. If stories like this make you rethink what really shapes history, if you enjoy uncovering the tiny triggers that changed everything, then don't drift away just yet. Give this video a like, share it with someone who still thinks history is just names and dates, and subscribe to the Domino Effect, where we pull on the loose threads of the past and see what unravels.